further ado, welcome to PM whenever ready.
So our aim is to maximize the representation of the democracy in terms of the agenda basis. And this is what the democracy meant for in the first place. And also the agenda that is non-primary but still potentially important being left behind in the democracy is actually negatively impacting society. That's why we proudly propose this motion. Firstly, on the model. So reasonably that we are going to assume the context where the regional representation is currently introduced, which is typically like the country is divided into each regional division, and each regional division is going to elect one candidate for the democracy. And we are going to replace this model to our model. What is our model? Firstly, that we are going to introduce certain category in terms of the agenda basis, and this is like things like the cultural or representative of minorities, or things like the social welfare policy, diplomacy, military policy, or environmental policy, whatever, so forth. And this kind of stuff is going to be dissected in a reasonable level, and this is going to be defined by the pre-existing government based on the prior election, like the situation with the public opinion poll. Like the government is going to conduct the public opinion poll after each election, and they conduct what is your primary like election policy, what is your secondary election policy, what is your tertiary election policy, what is so forth. And this is going to be gather these kind of data and create a reasonable number of the section. It's not going to be hundreds of the section, but reasonably it's like the 8 to 10 or whatever, so forth, right? And this is our model. Secondly, we are also going to decide the allocation of the seats for each category, and this is also going to be decided government. What do I mean by that? So, for example, that we may notice the tendency of the voters is to the prioritize the social welfare policy over the other kind of issues. Then it's possible on our model that we are going to allocate two seats for the social welfare category, and maybe that for other category we are only going to allocate one policy, because this is the situation. I'll take later. Because this is the actual situation or like the voters' tendency, which we notice on our side of the house. Lastly, that each voters has one vote for each section. So that is our model solution.
Yeah, so if you're talking about agendas being something that people care about, we also cater to those agendas by virtue of ministries existing, like the Ministry of Education toka. Is that not then symmetric?
Well, what we're pushing for is that the election is important, because this is going to be the centric, like the priority of the lawmakers to focus in the diet. That's our model. So firstly, what is happening right now in the election? Now, so the important premise we have to notice here is that the election is something, the mixture of the multiple agenda, which each voter has certain interests. Maybe some voters may have some interest in the diplomacy and the military, and the lower level of priority of the social welfare. For others, maybe vice versa. Or some people may have this like the regional representation of the women in the corporate world, or like some people more focused on the environmental policy. This is actually the mixture of the agenda, and each individual has typically multiple interests in each category, but they have some sort of priority. But what is currently happening right now is that the society and also the politicians tend to focus on only one most prominent agenda in the election. Because firstly, there's only one person is going to be elected in this regional section. Therefore, voters have to focus on have to make decisions based on their own top priority agenda. Secondly, the politicians also have to focus on this most prominent agenda, because unless you have a decent view or decent engagement to this type of the most prominent agenda, you're going to fail. Even if you have the other agenda to push, for example, some environmental policy or like the representative of the minority, unless you engage most prominent, for example, let's say the social welfare agenda, whatever, so forth, you are going to seen as the uncommitted person, or you're going to seen as unclever, and this is going to be degraded in the society. And the issue here is that, so maybe, for example, the prominent policy, maybe the overall social welfare, but maybe like the representation of the racial minority or women or environmental stuff may also potentially important or secondary or tertiary level, but this kind of issue is unlikely to be even discussed during election, or even getting traction, attention during the election. This is problematic. But secondly, these kind of politicians are likely to sensationalize this centric, most prominent topic, right? For example, if it's about social welfare, maybe like the people are going to, blame like some sort of immigrant people or like the poor individual, and they make these topics sensationalized so that they can gain the attention or divert attention to this most prominent issue, not the other secondary or other kind of issue, right? By doing so, they are going to outstanding, or they are going to be, seemingly more like superior to the other candidates. Lastly, that this situation likely to create a dichotomy or like the blaming, bashing culture among the politicians, right? Because the people, once again, that this election or attention is likely to be focused only one agenda, and in this situation, it's easier for the politician to take advantage by blaming or by ridiculing these other candidates in this debate center around one politics. Right? This is unlikely to happen under our model because we have the plural representation, and each politician has to some sort of comprehensive view to or like the may need some sort of reasonable reason to get traction on our side of the house. So what is the problem? Now, firstly, that this in this situation, that this kind of secondary agenda or like the agenda which may have the potential to be important or impact society is likely to be left behind during the election. Things like the environmental policy, representation of the racial minority, whatever so forth, right? These kind of things are unlikely to be even discussed or gaining traction, and this is problematic, right? Maybe the environmental policy of the stuff is very, very important, and they say, oh, there's a ministry, but budget allocation is decided by diet, right, to each ministry, right? So therefore, we say that this kind of like the attention during the election and also the incentive of the politician to commit this particular agenda is quite important. But secondly, principally, this is problematic, right? Because the democracy is meant for like the people's lives, right? It's not about the popular vote for each person, but it's likely more on the outcome of the politics. Therefore, the representation of the agenda level is quite important. Or this is the premise of the democracy. What is going to happen on our models? So this we are going to pluralize the agenda in the election, right? Because each voters have the each right to elect one person for each section, things like the environment, or like representation of the minorities, or like military diplomacy, or economics, whatever so forth, right? So each voters have certain concern or like certain interest to explore what is the actual problem, or if the certain voters have the multiple concern, they have the incentive to explore what each candidate are talking about, and also the media also have the incentive to pay attention to the comprehensive representation, right? It is under their side of the house, what's currently happening right now is that rather like media is focusing on only one central issue with more like the economic structure that's blaming each other. We think on our side of the house the situation is much more productive, and also the representation is maximized. Therefore, we are proud to propose.
Thanks, PM. One remark. Hello.
My gender pronouns are she, her. If you have any POIs, please raise your hand and stand up. Stand up, just raise your hand. Okay. Sorry, my speech in 3, 2, 1. The main case coming from government so far is that simply they're going to be more focused on different agendas and how that is so much better. We kick this out at the point where we say that this is not unique, right? There's already different ministries on our side of the house. There's already different ministries that have to focus on different sections. There's things like Monbukagakusho, there's things like Kankyosho. I'm not sure to what extent they're on their side of the house is that much unique or that much delta difference. But the second thing that they say is that so we say the difference is simply that agenda is the incentive to care about the agenda is still going to exist on the outside of the house. The difference is how people are going to allocate or where they're going to focus the agenda on. Simply on our side of the house, we wanted to prove two things. We're saying on our side of the house, politics will still be efficient enough, or the quality is still going to be fine. The second thing is how on their side of the house they're going to leave the most vulnerable people behind. So first up on the point like how politics are still going to be efficient. Anyways, politicians are still going to have access to professional information. Anyways, they're still going to have access to professionals. What I mean by this? Politicians, when they make decisions, they're not just randomly making decisions. They have access to things like think tanks. They have access to professionals. Or if they have like actual problem that they have, they call upon someone from like different areas and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, the politicians still do have access to information. The clear difference is that on their side of the house, there's going to be like we see that there's going to be more focus on like simply the politicians are probably going to be more focused on privileged people from privileged areas. So the mechanism for this is simply we say that this is likely because the technicians that they talk about, professionals that they talk about, they're likely to come from like places like cities, right? The reason for this is like the people that come from the professionals are likely to be people who come from like really prestigious universities or really prestigious companies and stuff like that. We say that these places are likely to be focused in like really cities and areas and stuff like that. The reason for this is simply because those areas probably have more resources and people have more incentive to go there because if there's like a high prestigious universities in that place, simply for like convenience, I think you choose to live in those areas. But the second reason here is simply because I think those areas have like the best places to work for. I think like as a person who wants to earn lots of money or like wants lots of prestige, these experts are likely to come from these areas. The third thing I want to say is like simply these cities have better accommodation. People just have a natural incentive to go to those areas where those things are more accessible. But then number 4, notice that like these prestigious cycle of like prestige, only people from prestigious areas being like part of the parliament is going to be like a cycle, right? Children of most prestigious people are the most likely to be continue engaging in policies and stuff like that. So the reason why we'd say this is bad, simply on their side of the house, these people are less likely to care about like politics that come from like less regionally privileged areas, right? We're talking about rural areas and stuff like that. The reason why we say that our side of the house is in fact actually better because like the clear delta is that there's like a geographical like we prioritize like people come from different geographic areas, right? On our side of the house, there's a guarantee that from no matter what prefecture you come from, no matter if you're like areas like more poor or like less privileged or like has less educated people, then you're still going to have like someone representing your area, right? And the reason why we say that this is like actually effective is because number 1, these people these elected people have as long as they're in parliament, they have like equal powers within the parliament, right? This means they have like equal voting rights, they're equal say in politics, and they're able to speak up in parliament and bring issues to the table. And then the second thing is like notice that on our side of the house, where like lots of people from more different districts or like more less privileged areas, there's like a more diversity in those people. This means that the politics are simply going to be more balanced, right? Because these people have more incentive to actually care about like their own districts and push about their own districts. But then we say the clear delta is simply that at the end we say that these like problems are only able to be represented best on our side of the house is because at the best case, like I think if you come from a privileged area, you're less likely to actually know about the reality that is going on in these less privileged areas, right? As a person who lived in like Tokyo their entire life, they probably don't know like how there's problems in rural areas. They don't know how there's like less schools where you can't get educated or like things like like because of that you have less future opportunities. You can get less higher paying jobs. You can't go to like you can't get good jobs or like those sort of things. This is like a significant like disparity that people from privileged areas simply do not understand. At the point, like the reason why this is important is because when problems are less proximate to you, they have less incentive to push for those things because they feel less urgency about those problems. This means that they bring less they're more likely to bring about other problems about their own areas, right? But then the reason why we say that this point is better, this point is important, is because I think these people from privileged areas are better off at the end of the day anyways, right? So the problems that they face are likely to be like less it's going to be more balanced. The first reason for this is because number 1, like the people who come from privileged areas at the end of the day, they don't have like that much big problems. Like infrastructure is probably like much better in city areas. But then number 2, notice that the local government is also likely to have more money in these areas. So like they can simply fix those areas. Whereas the rural areas is the places where they probably need policies that come from above, or like they actually need like help or like aid from the government. And the third thing that we want to say here is that simply I think matters or problems that people from like these privileged areas face are more well known, right? Things like Toyoko or like how there's like overcrowded by tourists or like how these shops are having trouble, like those sort of things are like those are like things that like appear in the news every day. Like it's generally well known. It's like things that people already feel some sort of urgency to attend to. And when at the point where like there's on the side of the house where there's like, these politicians that come from these areas more and more and more, like they're likely to keep promoting those issues. But then the reason why we say that this is problematic is because it hideaways the issues that are less noticeable, like issues that come from rural areas. At the point where there's like less on the side house where there's less likelihood of like these people from less privileged areas being able to represent themselves in parliament, bring their problems to the table, that is the point where we say that their problems are less likely to like actually be represented. And we say that this problem is actually really, really important because as I've already told you, like things like because those problems that we bring to the table is something that affects your future as well, right? If you get less educational opportunities, you're likely to suffer. If you have less like access to like transportation, it effectively affects your autonomy. I think that's the point where we say that these problems are actually really, really serious, right? I think what we want to simply push here is that the clear delta is that even if on their side of the house, they might be a bit more efficient. They might have a bit more like professionals, like those sort of things. So the efficiency might be a little bit higher, but we see that this is not important at the end of the day because efficiency is still guaranteed on our side of the house. At the end of the day, you're still going to have like politicians that are capable, politicians that know politics, and these politicians are going to still have access to like people who can provide them these information. They can consult think tanks. At the end of the day, we said that this delta is something that is very, very marginal. What is not marginal is like the way these policies are implemented, right? At the end of the day, on both sides of the house, politicians still care about agenda. These politicians still care about agenda, but the difference is like on our side of the house, these politicians care about where this agenda is implemented. So if you're talking about education, like this Mombukaku show isn't just going to care about this like city problems or like those sort of things. It's going to care about like this rural people living in Shimane or Inage or Chiba or like those sort of things, right? So we say that on our side of the house, we care about where those policies are implemented. And we say that because these people are likely to be the most vulnerable, like those people are the people that we have to protect, right? Because democracy at the end of the day is about like reflecting everyone's opinions. Everyone has like lots of different preferences. Everyone comes from lots of different regions. At that point, it's simply much better to make sure that policies are an accumulation of everyone's, like everyone has a chance to get their interests on board. I think on our side of the house, where we prove this better, we simply say that this is much better. And at the end of the day, we say when politicians bring policies to the table, like at the point where they know the urgency or like they feel the urgency, that's the point where they feel like they need to prioritize these policies, and that's the point where we say that we win this debate. Very proud to oppose.
Hello? Yeah.
何が乗ってんの？
よし、こう来るか時間だ。わいわい。
そいつが乗ってるっていうのは。
どうしたの？
いいかな。
あ、大丈夫。
Is it okay for judges to hear? I think I've heard that there's like some pop-ups.
We didn't hear anything.
Ah,
It's
okay, okay, okay. So it's okay. 大丈夫です。
え、両線始めちゃって大丈夫ですか ？Okay.
大丈夫です。
はい。Okay. I assume I'm audible. Yeah. He can pronounce for the position stand up, do not vocalize your point because it's about annoying. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before moving on to my arguments, let me just give 3 rebuttals against their side of the house. I think their main cases is that in their side of the house, because this kind of small voting small voting, this kind of area is not going to exist, no longer going to exist in their side of the house. This kind of minority that lives in that area is going to be fucked up. 3 engagement are here. Firstly, I'm not sure how in their side of the house this kind of minority is going to be saved in their side of the house, because I think all of the mechanism that they told us is about that. For example, most of the politicians are privileged. Most of the politicians come from Tokyo University or whatsoever, exist in either side of the house. And in that situation, I'm not sure how in their side of the house these kind of people from really minority areas I will be able to just go on to this election in the first place, especially considering that the running the election in and of itself costs a lot, and it is quite risky in the first place, because if you lose, you are going to be jobless. We think that this kind of privilege are anyway going to be the one that's going to run in the election. But 2, we think I'm not sure how in their side of the house minority are going to be saved as well, because even in their side of the house, this kind of politician that is going to be selected in each small district are going to be small, like one per a small district in the first place. And in that situation, if they say that there is geographical diversity within each prefecture in the first place, presumably there is going to be also geographical diversity within each small voting district in the first place. For example, in Inage that Yuka Chugasaki is living, presumably some people in Inage Yuka Chugasaki is privileged because they can go to Waseda University or whatsoever, but some people in Inage are so poor that they are going to be homeless or whatsoever in the first place. In that situation, we think that there's going to be diversity even within this Inage in the first place. I'm not sure how these kind of vulnerable people within the Inage is going to be saved. But certainly, we think that even in our side of the house, we think that this kind of voting area exists. The delta is the scale is going to be bigger in our side of the house. In that situation, even in our side of the house, presumably we have the border district for the Chiba area or border district for Okinawa area in the first place. Right? In that situation, if there's certain issue that these kind of that the people in that area cares about, for example, in Okinawa, people cares about less US troops or whatsoever, we think that these kind of ideas is anyway very going to be hard. And therefore, I'm not sure how the arguments are going to stand. Then moving on to my arguments, how in that side of the House, voting and the political discussion is going to work, and how in that side of the House, uniquely these kind of like minority issues are going to be cared. Firstly, in terms of voting, I have 4 different reasons why our side is good. Firstly, we think that the political speech is, we think that in that side of the House, these kind of politicians have the incentive to make the speech about a specific category in the first place. We think my partner already told you that in their side of the House, these kind of politicians are coerced to cater to this kind of like majority issue in the first place, precisely because the numbers of the politicians that is going to be selected in that area is 1 or 2, and also because you have to like engage to like political discussion in the first place. And in that situation, if you care about minority issue, like you are going to get questioned by other candidates about how you think about this majority issue. And in that situation, in their side of the House, these kind of politicians have to care about this kind of majority issue in the first place. And in that situation, considering that this kind of like that the time or the limit that the content there is going to be content limitation in their side of, in either side of the House in terms of like political speech or political debate, we think that it is quite difficult for these kind of people to care about minority issue in the first place. In that side of the House, because these kind of people are allocated in these kind of like specific fields, we think that if they are allocated in these kind of like military or whatsoever, even if the majority cares about like welfare, they have to talk about like military in the first place, and therefore we think that people can listen to these kind of like military policies. But secondly, we think that even if it is the case that in that side of the House, politicians talk about multiple policy, we think that in that side of the House, we can make deeper discussion in the first place. Because let's take the best case that in that side of the House, like politicians don't only care about like welfare, but they also cares about like environment or like education or whatsoever. In that case, we think that the amount of the time that these kind of politicians can use to this kind of like each specific policy is going to be smaller, and therefore they cannot talk about the details, like for example, the feasibility or the actual like long-term impact or whatsoever in the first place. In that situation, we think that in that side of the House, they can focus on one single like political issue, and therefore we think that they can talk about deep issue like feasibility or whatsoever, and therefore people can judge based on this. But thirdly, we think that it's easier for people in general to choose these competition in the first place, because in their side of the House, if like presumably like although these kind of like politician cares about like put like highest priority in this kind of like majority issue, if these kind of like politicians care about other minority issue, it's quite difficult for you to choose which politician to vote. Because for example, you might feel like, for example, you like Takaichi for the diplomat policy, but you don't like Takaichi for like feminist policy or whatsoever in the first place. In that situation, we think that in that side of the House, you can choose policy for each specific field, and you can choose policy for you can choose different candidate for each specific field. In that situation, it's going to be much more easier for you to vote. But fourthly, we think that in that side of the House, a single issue voter can easily vote in the first place, because even in that side of the House, if you have the issue that you don't care, if you have the agenda you don't care, you don't have to vote. You can just do you can just not vote to that specific agenda in the first place. And in that situation, that is a unique moment that single issue voter that cares about like minority issue are going to be saved in that side of the House. But also, we think that in that side of the House, we think that when these kind of like people are past election, we think that the political sphere are going to work much more efficiently. But before that, yes.
Majority and minority disagreement also exists in like smaller issues, like for example, city development, immigrations, and so on. How then this is going to be catered under your side?
One, we think that, as my partner already told you, that in terms of like a majority catered issue, we think that even in our model, we are fine with having like multiple seats for that agenda in the first place, which you never engage, and it is too late for you to engage. But secondly, we think that in either side of the House, this kind of like regional agenda is not going to be safe. We think that even in their side of the House, like for example, poor people in Nagoya, it's not going to be safe at the end of the day. And lastly, how in that side of the House political spheres are going to work? I think that the problem that we have, firstly, we think that they told us like stupid things. Like the ministry exists, like fair, but like ministry is the one that carry out the policy. We think that politicians are the one that chooses what kind of policy is going to be made in the first place. And in that situation, even in their side of the House, if these politicians don't care about these specific policies that majority people don't care, we think that it's quite difficult for these kind of like ministry to make that what kind of like policy what kind of strategy that they are going to make in each ministry in the first place. And in that situation, just saying ministry exists is stupid. But secondly, we think that in that side of the House, like better like discussion in each agenda is going to happen. Why? Because in that side of the House, we see that in that side of the house, we think that the people don't, like politicians don't have the incentive to like discuss about this kind of minority like agenda in the first place, because they feel that even if they don't like discuss to this kind of like minority agenda, this kind of like voter is not going to get mad, because if they care about majority agenda, we think that the voter are going to be happy, right? In that situation, we think that that incentive for these kind of people to talk about minority agenda doesn't exist. But in that side of the house, politicians politicians win the election because of that minority agenda, and therefore they feel the responsibility to talk about this kind of agenda, and therefore we think that these kind of like minority discussion are going to be made. But all of these reasons are proposed.
DPM, yellow.
Right, just give me a second.
By the way, the camera of the device is apparently frozen, so if you can
Yeah, I
try
think
to
I fixed
refresh.
it.
Yeah.
Alright,
Okay.
yeah. Right, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I know government wants to make this debate about majorities versus minorities, but that's not a very clear distinction, right? Because even within minorities, there can exist majorities. That is simply our case, right? Because when we create regional distinctions for, the representations within parliament, it is at that point then, even if Saitama is technically a minority within Tokyo, it becomes a majority for the politician that is representing Saitama. If that is then true, then the way by which we attend to a lot more minorities is by turning them into majorities for all of these representatives, right? Firstly, responses. One, they talk about, they question how minorities are actually better catered on our side. 3 responses here. One, because the people that are elected from these constituencies that are by nature minorities technically, the fact that they have to live with them and therefore experience the same problems that they have to experience. Also, secondly, because they have to, they went to the same education, they have the same institutions that these people have to go through. Also, thirdly and most importantly, because everyone within the pool of Saitama cares about Saitama, right? Everyone within the pool for Chiba cares about Chiba. If that is then true, then anyone elected from these constituencies necessarily cares about that constituency in particular, right? Note this is unique on our side, because even if they want to talk about how, you can still care about multiple issues, how they say, if anything, that it's easier to choose politicians because of that. Multiple responses, right? Because first of all, multiple agendas will happen regardless. Even if they have like just one committee for, rather just one vote for like just like education issues. Where education? What kind of education? Are you putting money into like high school or somewhere else, right? So if that is then true, then you also have multiple agendas for the same candidate, right? Maybe you like the candidate's policy on more, free meals for young students, but you don't like their policy about more scholarships for foreign students, right? That same candidate can have multiple agendas within that same, let's say, agenda. If that is then true, then this idea of, this, one candidate only doing one thing is actually not something that they're doing either, right? But more importantly, they want to talk about, how it's easier for people to actually vote, right? Probably not true. I'll prove this to you in my process material by proving why actually their side has far less voters, right? Last thing then, they talk about how they still have to care about the problems of every area, but the problem at the end of the day is if I can prove to you that you just simply garner less voters, there's less reason for people to vote on their side, but also more importantly because they only service limited agendas insofar as that the voter base that does remain is primarily from the most let's say most educated, most like well-off areas within like a city. If that is then true, then you cannot claim to care about every area because your incentive comes from only specific areas. Why then why then does government garner far fewer votes at the end of the day? The reason here is because why people vote. People vote for things like singular issues. They vote for things like lived problems that they face in their day-to-day lives in their geographic areas. They also vote for things like just looks or just things like vibes, right? That this people is from me, is from my place, right? is one of us, right? But lastly, the last reason people vote is because they finally are able to have this illusion of understanding, that they understand politics, that they understand the policies that the person is bringing up, right? If this is then true, why are there far bigger barriers on their side of the world? 3 reasons. 1, because there's simply many more votes you have to make, right? In our side, every person gets 1 vote for their constituency, right? Their geographical location. So you just have to make 1 vote. So that's just 1 barrier. Contrast that to their side, where you have to make literally 8 votes, and not only just votes in general, but also votes across various domains that you probably either don't care about or you don't know about. This brings me to my second point, which is the fact that Now you're voting on technical agendas. This is bad because of one, this is just difficult to access, especially for the vulnerable areas that we're talking about, right? Because these, areas in the Inaka, etc., maybe they don't even go to high school, etc., or maybe they don't go to I don't know, they don't specialize in anything, or they don't really know about the finances of Tokyo or whatever. They don't really know about other situations. If that is then true, then the fact that you make this into technical agendas sounds really nice, maybe for Todai students, or maybe for people that are very, very educated. Everyone else feels like this is a big barrier to first understand and then vote, right? But then secondly, even if this wasn't that big of a barrier in of itself, the fact that you have so many different technical agendas makes that barrier exponentially far harder to actually come across, right? The last reason, the last barrier to voting that exists uniquely on their side is the fact that for a lot of people, a majority of the people technically speaking, you just simply have no local representatives, right? So if you're living in anywhere other than Shinjuku, and every politician, every candidate is from Shinjuku, is from the main areas of Tokyo, then you being from not that place also have far less reason, like I talked about earlier, right? You vote for things like vibes, people that feel proximate to you. If none of them feel proximate to you either, and all the technical reasons or things that you either just don't understand or don't care enough to, look into, then at the end of the day, the impact is twofold. Firstly, you just simply have far fewer voters. This is bad because you just simply have a far lesser representative democracy. But more importantly, is who they're representing. I'll take you after this. The people that they uniquely then represent, so the majority of this remaining voter base, is going to be the most privileged voters because they have the most time on their hands. They have the most education to understand all of these technical issues, and most importantly, most of these representatives are going to be from their districts. If that is then true, then all of their analysis about, these incentives coming from the Inaka, you also have to care about those issues. Why? Because you're not getting voted in by them. You don't have to care about them, even if they, get pissed off at you. They weren't voting in the first place. They didn't have time for it. They didn't really understand this sort of stuff. If that is then true, then the only people at the end of the day they care about are the people that already were for the most. I'll take the POI.
Our model doesn't force people to vote for each every section. Like if you have a three priority sections, then you are only focused on these kind of three sections, right? Because they have the incentive to do so. I don't think this model is going to disincentivize this kind of people from voting.
Yeah, one, it does coerce people to vote because at the end of the day, you still have to make 8 votes. That's fiat by the info site. And secondly, even if that's not true, maybe you can choose within those 8 votes. The fact of the matter is still you're presented with 8 options, right? You're still, let's say, what's the word? Mentally or psychologically or socially incentivized to make the best out of your vote. If you're taking the time to go to the polling station, why are you just going to make 1 vote? Why not do all the other votes, right? So because there are social factors that are also to be considered, but also generally, the motion generally fiats all 8 votes. If that isn't true and every other bit of analysis still stands, then probably they're not really doing really well, right? So at that point, we've proven to you that we simply have far better representativeness, and the policies that are tabled and voted upon are far more diverse, are catering to a lot more people that actually need it, right? Then why are we simply better on agendas? Because firstly, how many agendas do we have? They want to say MEXT and all of these agencies, etc., are not governmental, but they are, right? Governments have agencies, and they can, by that metric, have multiple agendas. And we can also do polling on our side for what kind of agendas do we want to care about, right? And then have these politicians vote for that sort of stuff. But the difference comes in not what agendas are on the table, but how these agendas are discussed, right? Because simply for the fact that in our world, more politicians have far more diverse lived experience by virtue of the fact of geographic separateness, right? Because secondly, we just simply have more specific problems or more region-specific problems tabled insofar as the most vulnerable people are affected by these things. That's really good. And most importantly, we just simply have a far stronger voting bloc for these issues. Even if they table it, they don't have votes for it. And at the end of the day, they don't need to vote for it because that's not how they get elected on their side of the world.
Hello, God work.
Gender pronoun he, him. I'll take POI after 5 minutes. So please stand up. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think our burden to prove is that our world is not to prove that our world is perfect, but rather to prove only that our world is slightly better than the opposition. Very proud. So I'll deal with firstly the issue came from the DLO about the voters' participation. There are three things. Firstly, opposition or like underestimate how hard it is to make votes in status quo. In status quo, you need to look at when you look at, for example, Sanae Takaichi, you need to look at many like policies that they stand for and like make calculus, right? For example, I support Takaichi in foreign policy, but I don't support her for like how like a feminist movement and such. And you need to make very nuanced decision. Maybe if you vote for her, maybe I can get priority like good policies for foreign affairs, but not for feminist movement. How do I care about that? Especially when you have like 2 to 3 core votes for like core things that you care. I think status quo is also really, really hard in the status quo as well, right? 2, even in our side, you don't need to make 8 votes very considerably. You can make like single vote in our side as well. I think that is likely, especially when you, for example, when welfare, for example, candidates running, the incentive to say, even if you are casting 1 vote, only care about welfare, just come and vote for me in just like welfare district, right? I think these kind of messaging is likely, and those kind of voters turnout is likely in our side of the house as well. So I don't think it's like that huge, like symmetric. But thirdly, government side mentioned about geographical proximity. But what difference does it make when you vote in the district of Aichi, like Mikawa, and district of like the Hoshigaoka, right? I'm not sure what they're getting there in the Southern House. So I'll talk about 2 things from now. Firstly, who is going to be elected, and secondly, what kind of policy is going to be like, what kind of like impact we can deliver, and how likely we say we are likely. So firstly, about who is going to be elected. The opposition side claim is to say that privileged people are going to be elected. 3 things. Firstly, privilege tilt exists either in either side of the house, because only like people who have certain times or certain resources can have time to run for the election as well, right? So this is a common like problem for each side of the house. I don't think it's necessarily different. Secondly, opposition's nuance is say only people from the university, only privileged people is going to be elected. 2 things. Our nuance is not to say specialists only come from academics, right? Our nuance is that there's a specific election like process is going to occur. For example, there's a specific electoral like district, like electoral process running for the poor, like saving poor like welfares, and for those people, maybe even you are not from university, you are elected because you are very like you have been doing like saving poor as an NGO for decades in this like Aichi Prefecture or workforce. At the end of the day, who is going to be elected in certain category is decided by the people, and people like and people if they're convinced that they are like entitled to getting votes as for example someone who care about poor and like actually reflect my opinion and so forth, right? So therefore, their nuance is not correct. I think but rather in our side of the house, our nuance is that people like who deem that voters are voters deem that are like capable of carrying out stuff is going to be elected in either side, like in our side of the house. In our side, it's more specific for the job. In their side of the house, it's generalistic. Why is this problem when you're generalist? This is because you cannot cater to every issue, right? In their side of the house, politicians need to care about foreign policies, because people do ask about like every like voting issues. For example, Sanae Takaichi is asked about foreign policies, but also welfare policies, and you are deemed as like because you're deemed that you are capable of being able to represent all of them. In our side of the house, we divide work and we make it so that people can carry out better work for each like special section that they can represent. Third thing is about geography, which opposition side is so keen about. There are 2 things. Firstly, in our side of the house, it's not that in our side there's zero geographical representation, right? We have electoral district for, in their side of the house, they have electoral district for Inage. But in our side of the house, we have electoral district for North Chiba, and within North Chiba, there's like 8 categories and stuff. Therefore, and I have 2 implications for this. One, they need to prove why this. One implication actually. What they need to prove is that this geographical nuance of Inage versus North Chiba, why this matters so much in their side of house to the extent that people make like it influences voter turnout or the way in which people vote. I'm not sure what's like what's going to be so significant in that level. Two, they need to prove why current standard is the perfect one, right? Because current like electoral district is drawn in a very arbitrary way by politicians, maybe in some countries to drawn like to benefit certain parties in gerrymandering way. Therefore, in their side of the house, it's not perfect and do not reflect people's opinion in many instances. So geography, I'm not sure like to what extent this can be a benefit. But let's assume that geographical like proximity, geographic nuance is very, very important. The trade-off here is that in our side of the house, we can better reflect the people's preference in terms of the policies, like each policies. In their side of house, probably they have more nuance about geography, about like inage and stuff. Why is policy more important? I have two things. Firstly, to engage the government, opposition. They said ministry can take care about policies. No, firstly, like ministry can be made or like abolished by government, and the budget allocation is made when prioritization is made by the government. When the decision making is dictated by the end policy makers, like just having a policy ministry is not enough. Secondly, let's say in their side of house, you have more like geographically nuanced candidate. You send one inage representative to the diet. What can this person do in the diet, right? How can they make coalitions and make what kind of policies? In our side of the house, it's more dictated by policies. So probably in like feminists represented in North Chiba have something in common with like feminist representative in Shimane, and they can unite and like have a coalition in the national diet. We have more certainty in the kind of change we can make. In their side of house, they are never clear about what kind of policies they can run. Therefore, probably propose.
Thank you. Go quick. Or quick.
Okay, gender pronoun she, her. If you have any POI, please raise your hand. I'll try my best to take one. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. People have different opinions, not only on priorities, on what should be done first, but also on how then the execution it should be done. So the first question I would like to answer here is that why section-based electoral system will further hinder democracy and also reduce minority bargaining power. But first of all, I would like to point out the lack of burden fulfillment from the government side of the House today. Because first, they fail to acknowledge that section-based electoral system collapses the lower level district-based representation and starts from a regional level, right? This is a significant difference that they cannot just shove it off and say that like, diversity is going to be symmetric at the end of the day. Just be comparative and like be realistic on this complex situation, right? Because when each section candidates actually need to cater to like larger demographics, then it means that it's very likely that voices are going to be diluted at the end of the day, right? Imagine if like this kind of like votings are going to be done more in a regional like Tokyo level or like Chiba level, which are often like really big and often have like higher diversity at the end of the day. It means this kind of like politicians are more likely going to cater more towards issues or like solutions that caters more towards like the majority. A privileged politician in Inage has way higher chances to understand the difficulty living in like such a rural area in comparison to privileged politicians that come from like the main part of like Chiba. It means that like comparatively still under our side of the house, this kind of like nuances are more likely going to get better represented. But then secondly, do note that like as I pointed out in the POI, they reduce the complexity on like different voting issues to just simply matter of like prioritization, right? They're just saying that like majority and minority always care about like different things. This is empirically untrue because there's so many issues that like the more important it is, the more likely that majority and minority actually have like different opinion on it, right? We talk about like immigration regulations or even like urban development, whether or not like a certain area should do like more urbanization or like whether they should keep like maintain this kind of like rights for like more rural work, for example, like farmers, this kind of like points and so on. It means that under the side of the house, they never necessarily explain why then they're going to cater on this kind of like issues. It means under their side, this is when majority are more likely going to win like most of the times, right? I think the issue is that like they're trying to frame this by saying that like these are the minority cases. In majority cases, priority is going to be different. I think I would like to flip this because especially this is also engagement when they say coming from the first speaker that each section that's going to be voted for each regional is going to be decided based on a poll. It means like I'm not necessarily understand why then minority issues are actually going to be like voted enough for them to actually become like a meaningful point that they're going to be voted on, right? It means that anyway, at the end of the day, the section that's going to be chosen under the rest of the house are going to be the one that's going to be majority agreed upon based on the poll that they already mentioned before. It means most of the issues are probably going to be really diluted. There's going to be like more covered by like majorities to even begin with. But let's assume that like that's true. That also includes like minority. But I think there is like a more glaring issues that you need to point out, right? Recognize that this means that they're locking away certain regions for even having any representative on like certain issues that can matter. Even like they're talking about like why probably Okinawan people are the only region that probably going to vote regarding like international issues regarding bordering countries rather than people in the middle of like Akita or like upper part that don't really have like any bordering issues. These are dangerous because it means they're walking away literally people that probably have their degree of like livelihood that are also going to impact it, right? Because note that politics is not only about like specific region but also about like how like other things interact with each other. I think so far they never necessarily explain on why this is justified. I think under the of the house it's already clear that this kind of like policies are likely going to be only catering towards like a specific like people. But then what we have already proven to you, right? When in the case of like majority and minority is going to clash, at least under our side comparatively, we provide to you a more lower level like catering towards like a smaller geographical platform. It means that people are going to be catered on a more intimate level at the end of the day, right? Sure, we cannot deny that probably majority minorities still exist, even like a smaller section like in Nagoya, for example. But still, comparatively, this is going to be much, much better than their side of the house because there access a representative that understand the nuances, the small issues, local issues that this kind of people that are having to go through that simply do not access under the side of the house. We just told you they're more of this kind of like bargaining power for like minority voters at the end of the day. Because it means that like as long as there is like a representative, it means they do have like some sort of like view that's going to represent them in like a more higher level. Do note that this does not exist. This is not symmetric. Under the rest of the house, people need to vote on like every single different issues that's going to be very diluted on like different sections at the end of the day. It means that it's very much more difficult under their side to actually cater towards like minority at the end of the day. But why then this is really important, right? Do note that people live on every single issue. I don't think even if like minority care a little bit more about environment, they don't need a finance rules finance policies at the end of the day. It means that it's very important why then we have like a more representative that can actually cater their voices on more general issues. Because under our side of the house, even if it's wider in terms of like agenda, it's still specific in terms of like regions. And we already given you multiple explanations on why then this is going to be much better. But before that, sure.
In your side of the house, when you make general speech, it's not like details about the policy, like feasibility, so whatsoever is going to be left in the first place. How in your side of the house people can largely vote?
But I think like they never necessarily explain first the capacity and the rest of the house. But then secondly, I think there are probably more incentive for politicians to explain the details, especially in the lower area. I understand that Trump is just saying like build a wall doesn't really make sense, but probably people in like smaller sections have like a very specific agenda that they really want to cater to, which means like very likely that they're going to explain how. Second question I would like to answer here then. How then voting system is just simply going to be done much poorly under the rest of the house and why comparatively still going to be better? I think as we have clearly proven to you, especially coming from like the DLO, is that the number of votes significantly increased, and it means that the barrier of entry for people to even have the knowledge to vote are going to increase under the house, right? But the response is just saying that like people can just vote on issues that actually matter. If that's the case, I don't necessarily understand why then this kind of like more nuanced discussion or like more democracy representative is going to be better under the house, right? It's more likely that people are only going to vote on things that actually matter. For example, like young people is going to talk about like issues about about like jobs. Then like older people are only going to vote about like things about like pension. It's something that's going to be like really diluted. People don't really discuss on like things that actually matter as a whole. But then secondly, we also already explained to you why in most cases, rather than pick and choose, people probably going to rather not vote at all, because it's just going to be significantly much more difficult, right? For you to even have to try to vote like for a very specific thing, they just say that like you need to understand the really nuanced issues, because like this kind of people are likely going to be technocrats. Those are things that are likely going to be not feasible, and that's why they're going to be much less vote, less representation, and going to be less, much less better democracy in the rest of the house. Due to these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thanks. I'll reply.
I like that POI just now because it assumes that every voter makes a vote very rationally. And it also proves their own case, which is to say that all of their voters are the most rational and therefore the most educated and therefore the people that have the most time to be so rational. I think that's important because that proves who's voting in which side of the paradigm, right? Because it's uniquely what they prove by that POI, that it's uniquely in their paradigm that only the richest of the richest, the most educated with the most time can even vote at all. Because if you're not fully rational, if you're not fully aware of all like the complexities, all the nuances of what this politician is doing, then you can't vote on their side because you have no other connection to them, right? You can't vote on a single issue with them because now it's very technical. You can't vote, for politicians there because you feel like vibe with them because they're probably not from your district more often than not because of restrictions. If that's then true, then that perfectly well buys into our case of just having less votes overall. We can discuss if these are less or more rational votes, but a democracy doesn't care about that because it wants to represent the voices of the people, not the rational voices only. So at that point, I think they already concede that they have less votes. They can talk about rational votes, but I think the number is still down there, which takes out all of their impacts, right? Because if they want to be so representative for everyone and anyone, for all these different issues, then they can't have both at the same time, right? While locking everyone out in the first place. I want to make the difference within this debate very clear. The first one is who gets into parliament, right? They want to tell you that it's uniquely on our side that these people are very general. They make general claims. Well, one, that's good because now that's easier for more people to understand, therefore more votes, so better representativeness, right? So people can at least own these politicians. But more importantly, they miss the nuance that we're pushing. Their politicians might be a lot more specific in agenda, but they're very general in region. We tell you our politicians are very general, might be general in agenda, but are very specific to region. So at the end of the day, the way you need to make is what is more important. Is it the region or is it the agendas? Insofar as on both sides, it's very easy to understand these agendas. You can read news articles, you can hire think tanks. They want to ask, oh, how are you catering to the practical manifestations of these policies? Think tanks. There's government agencies to figure that stuff out. The politicians are just to vote on that and get their information from those sources, or have other agencies figure out the manifestation or the practical, let's say, the how do you get it going, etc. This is not the politician's job, right? They're not contractors, they're politicians. So then at the end of the day, if it is true that agendas can be catered to on both sides and agendas can be understood on both sides, then what is uniquely, let's say, very important at the end of the day is going to be what is unique to regions, right? Because it is very unique to regions what issues people encounter because of things like, school is only within your region, housing is only within your region, the public transport is something that you're locked out of any other region's public transport. So if all of that is true and their side doesn't prove any uniqueness to agenda, then it must be true that a politician that is unique to regions better democratizes or better represents the unique problems that most people face most of the time. This is not a majority versus minority debate. This is a overall majority versus a democratized majority on our side, because now all these minorities on their world are full majorities on our side because that's a full voting base of individual politicians, right? Then the other difference is going to be the agendas themselves, right? What is discussed? They concede that maybe you can only vote for singular agendas, right? So that means you're locking out all other agendas of representativeness, right? So only 3 people vote for the finance and economics and all that weird stuff, but everyone else just votes for public transport, right? So their world has no democracy for a lot of agendas and a lot of democracy for some agendas. So that's already very skewed. More importantly, though, if you don't buy that, what you do buy is within each agenda, the only policies you can discuss are ones that are directly hinged on your chances of success later on, right? Insofar as you get the most media attention, the most votes from catering to the most privileged already, then you need to balance against this by having a system that allows for better representation of people that aren't so automatically catered to, right? Of people that don't get the media attention. And it's uniquely our side that provides the balance, right? So we push for regionality because the media won't do that. And so insofar as the media and in general social incentives already cater to the privileged, they're already privileged for God's sake, then at the end of the day, the balance is far better on our side where we platform those that are otherwise deplatformed.
And go for five. Go for five.
What's exclusive and what's symmetric on both sides? Probably the candidates from privileged status may be symmetric. Politicians and voters have to face multiple agenda and also the complex priorities issue. Maybe symmetric. But what difference is that if the politician, whether the politician weigh more time and also the focus and the resources on the selective specific issue during the election, or with the more nuanced understanding of this particular regional division, or the politicians have a more focus on each agenda basis with less focus on the nuances of the regional division. And which is better? Which I'm going to bring to the two broad questions to their case and weigh against our case. Now, probably they brought two things. Firstly, in the regional representation. So structurally, we have the regional division on our side of the house as well. Then what's the difference? And probably what they assume in this debate is that this kind of regional representation region has a certain singular or a selected issue or focus on specific section, right? In these instances, probably if so, then during the after implementing this policy time to time, our government is going to conduct opinion poll, and this is going to find that the tendency that voters have to are focusing on, for example, things like the public transportation or welfare for the elderly people. Then, if that kind of tendency is found, we are going to allocate multiple seats that already provided in our model, which was never engaged by the cyber house. So I'm not sure to what degree the level of representation or level of the nuances or unified singular agenda push is going to change on both cyber house. But secondly, their hidden assumption is that regional districts representation is quite good. But it's not true, right? It's quite arbitrary, as Gabriel already pointed out. Maybe I have the affiliation or the psychological affection to my congregation, but this may be a part of the one regional division in terms of the election. In that instances, probably my issue is not going to be represented in the best way. And this is actually happening in multiple countries. So we don't think they are going to assure the best representation, or they don't really explain the the inherent value of the regional representation in the first places. We don't think in this respect they have the standout in this debate. Secondly, in terms of voter turnout, we don't think any favorable data for their cyber house. So if voters have singular issue to focus, probably these voters even anyway find their issue in each cyber house, and they're going to vote based on that, and they don't have any attention to other issues. There's no difference between two sides. But maybe the situation is where situation to get complicated is the voters have certain multiple interests with certain priority, whatever so forth, right? For these kind of voters, probably their model is far more complicated or burdensome because they have to make priority with a complex the priority because maybe you have the favorable view to the person A in terms of social welfare, but you are very against for this person in terms of diplomacy. And for you, both of these topics is important. In this respect, this is quite burdensome. And also, as Deputy Prime Minister already talked about, under their cyber house, that airtime or the focus on each agenda is going to be less, right? Maybe this kind of politician may broach certain issue, but it's just cast assertion. There's no the sufficient airtime or focus or discussion of the feasibility of each issue. Situation gets much more complicated, or it's more burdensome or emotionally distressing. On our cyber house, you can be quite distinct in each section. Probably you are more eager to vote because you can explore each candidate with two different sections. So we don't think that in terms of voter turnout they have the priority. Then why our model is more our benefit is more important? Because as we already told you, the agenda is something that for the people's lives it has a certain impact, right? Labor right issues are quite important for the young laborers, or maybe things like the environmental protection is actually tangibly impacting these kind of people, and that's why the representation, the voting is quite important, right? Ministry don't have the authority to decide politics or like budget allocation or law in the first places. That is why the voters should be incentivized by people on the ground. That's quite important, right? On response from their several houses, well, there's multiple issues on their several house as well. That's quite lazy response, right? We already told you the politicians have the tendency to focus on the specific issue and quite getting likely to ignore to the other issue. With that, this representation is substantially maximized on our several house. That is why we propose.